So now I want to talk a little bit about the budget balance. The budget balance is just the money that the government brings in, which is tax revenues, minus the money that they spend. So government spending on goods and services and transfer payments. And so when the government brings in more money than they're spending, it's running a budget surplus. So if the budget balance is greater than zero, the government is running a budget surplus. If the government is spending more than it's bringing in, it's running a budget deficit. And if they're bringing in exactly as much as they're spending, we say that there's a balanced budget. And so when the government runs a deficit, they have to borrow money to pay for their excess purchases or transfer payments. And in order to borrow money, this is where the government issues those government securities, so like treasury bills for our federal government. And when the government runs a budget surplus, it starts paying back its debt. So the national debt, which I'm sure you've all heard quite a bit about, is the sum of past deficits minus the sum of past surpluses. All right, let's work through an example. Which of the following is false? In Cadbia, government revenue is $35,000, while government expenditure is $50,000. The Cadbian government has a budget deficit. In Cadbia, government revenue is $35,000, while government expenditure is $50,000. The Cadbian national debt is increasing. In Fernia, government revenue is $78,000, while the government expenditure is $22,000. The Fernian government has a budget surplus. In Fernia, government revenue is $78,000, while government expenditure is $22,000. The Fernian government has a national debt that is decreasing. In Platinia, government revenue and expenditure are both $5,000. The Platinian national debt is increasing. Pause the video and try to answer this question, and then restart the video and we'll go over it. Okay, so in answer choice A, the government expenditure exceeds the government revenue. So that means that the Cadbian government is running a budget deficit. And if the government is running a budget deficit, then that means that their national debt is increasing. In Fernia, revenue is greater than expenditure, so that's a budget surplus. And that means that they are paying down their national debt. So national debt would be decreasing. And in Platinia, if government revenue and expenditure are both $5,000, then the national debt wouldn't be increasing. It should be staying the same. So answer choice E is false. This chart shows the federal budget balance as a percent of GDP from 1986 to 2014. And so if the budget balance as a percent of GDP is negative, then that means that we're running a budget deficit. And if it's positive, that means that the government is running a budget surplus. And so what you can see is that over the last 30 years, the government has been running mostly deficits of varying sizes. And the last time that the U.S. government ran a budget surplus, the last time that we brought in more money than we spent, was between 1998 and about 2001. Outside of that period, the government has run budget deficits, typically between 2 and 4% of GDP. But you can see that in the Great Recession, which occurred in 2008, you can see that that budget deficit grew by quite a bit to almost 12% of GDP. And that was due to a combination of automatic stabilizers in the economy and also discretionary fiscal policy that the government engaged in the wake of the Great Recession. So you might be wondering, if the U.S. has consistently been running a budget deficit, doesn't that mean that we would have a very large national debt? And the answer is yes. So you can look at this if you go to usdebtclock.org, which kind of keeps track of how our U.S. national debt is changing. And so this screenshot was taken on October 26th, Saturday, in the early afternoon. So if you go to that website now, it'll probably look a little different. But let's zoom in on the revenue and spending. So you can see that our national debt is $22.9 trillion. Which works out to a debt per citizen of $69,467. And so we can also see here that the federal budget deficit currently is about $1.03 trillion right here. And that budget deficit is a combination of the federal spending of $4.5 trillion and the federal tax revenue of about $3.5 trillion. So when we subtract the tax revenue from federal spending, we get that budget deficit. And so one thing we can look at if we're wondering, where does the tax revenue come from? We can look at over here on the table to see that a lot of the tax revenue comes from income taxes and payroll taxes that are paid by workers and employers for each worker that's hired. And then a much smaller part of tax revenue comes from corporate taxes, excise taxes, and tariffs. And if we want to look at what we're spending that money on, the largest budget items are Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is health insurance for the elderly, 65 and over. Medicaid is health insurance for people that meet a certain income threshold, so they have income below a certain threshold. Social Security is our basically kind of retirement income for people 60, I believe the retirement age now is 67. You can collect Social Security earlier than that at a reduced rate, but mostly for our citizens who are 67 and older. Those are our two biggest budget items. And then defense or the military, interest on debt, income security programs, federal pensions, so federal retirement programs for federal employees, and food and agricultural subsidies. And so, when we have years where we are spending more than we're bringing in taxes, that national debt grows, and it's been growing since the last time we had a budget surplus, which again was in the early 2000s. And so in order to decrease that national debt, we would either have to cut government spending and or increase tax revenue. And so one way to represent the debt, one common way, is as a percentage of GDP. And so the U.S. gross domestic product is about $21.5 trillion. the U.S. national debt is 22.9 trillion. So the debt to GDP ratio in 2019 is 106.3%, which is almost double what it was in 2000. And so to give you some context, this is data from the World Bank in 2016 on central government debt as a percentage of GDP for other countries. And what you can see is that Japan has currently the highest government debt at 195.5% of GDP. And one of the big reasons for Japan's very high debt and growing debt is the aging of their population. So in Japan, fertility rates are very low and life expectancy is very high. So the Japanese government doesn't have a broad enough base of workers to support the aging population, the retired population. Because the way things kind of work is that during your working years, you pay taxes on your earnings, and then when you retire, you end up collecting money from the government. In the U.S., that's called Social Security, and Medicare, which is the health insurance for the elderly. In Japan, they have similar systems to protect their elderly citizens in retirement, and those are costing more to implement than the government is bringing in tax revenue. And so while there are many countries with rather high levels of debt at 100% of GDP or higher, there are also many countries with very low levels of debt. For instance, Peru has 23.2%, a 23.2% debt to GDP ratio, Switzerland 19.8%, the Russian Federation 14.2%. So it's not a given that countries are going to have very high debt to GDP ratios. The things that go into determining that are the level of government spending and tax policy in the country. And just to be clear, there's actually a lot of countries for which the World Bank does not have data in 2016. So this is just a small sample size of countries. So there might be more countries with very high levels of debt and more countries with very low levels of debt. But this gives you an idea of the spread. So you might be wondering why we should care about government debt. What impact does that have on your life? So one immediate impact of government debt is that debt is money that the government has borrowed. And when there's a higher demand for borrowing in the economy, that's going to increase long-run interest rates. And we say that can crowd out private investment. So it leaves less money available for firms that want to borrow money to invest. And if we have less investment by firms, then we might see decreased growth in the long run. Because one of the things that can impact growth is firms investing in research and development and investing in new and more efficient production processes. So outside of the consequences on economic growth, the other consequence of government debt is that it can put pressure on future generations. So debt is not a problem as long as you can pay it back. So as long as the countries are fulfilling the promises that they're making when they issue those bonds, those treasury, for the U.S. government, those treasury bills, as long as governments can fulfill those promises that they're making and, pay back that debt over time, then debt is not a very big deal. The problem comes when countries have so much debt that they start to not be able to pay it back. And that means that they're either going to have to raise tax revenues in order to pay back that debt, or default on the debt. And when a country defaults on their debt, basically says that they can't pay it back according to the terms that were set, then that decreases their credibility in the long run. People don't trust them anymore, and it becomes very difficult for them to borrow money in the future, much more expensive and costly. So that's why it puts, it basically delays these consequences and puts the pressure on future generations to have to deal with that debt burden. Okay, so let's do an example. Think about an economy with a recessionary output gap. Which of the following statements are true? The government should decrease taxes or decrease spending to restore the economy to potential GDP. The government should increase taxes or increase spending to restore the economy to potential GDP. Cutting taxes will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Increasing government spending will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Increasing tax rates will shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. If the government does not intervene, nominal wages will fall, shifting the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. So pause the video, and once you've answered the question, come back and we'll review. Okay, so if the economy is in a recessionary output gap, so output is below potential output, then in order to push the economy back towards potential GDP, the government would have to engage in expansionary fiscal policy. An expansionary fiscal policy involves decreasing net taxes and increasing government spending to increase aggregate demand. So the government should decrease taxes or decrease spending. It needs to decrease taxes or increase spending. So that means that B is incorrect as well. Cutting tax rates will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. We said that it would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Increasing government spending will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Again, that will increase the aggregate demand, shift it to the right. Increasing tax rates will shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. Changing tax rates is going to affect aggregate demand, not aggregate supply. And if the government does not intervene, nominal wages will fall, shifting the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. So that is correct. That is our self-correcting mechanism. So when we're in a recessionary gap, unemployment is high, there's excess supply in labor markets, and that's going to push nominal wages down and increase short-run aggregate supply.